I'm going to welcome our next guest speaker to share his screen, Dr. Charlie Martin with University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, also known as IFAS. And he's going to be sharing about nearshore fishes and what we know about them a decade after the spill. And Charlie's fun fact is that he is a two-time, I have to look at the name of it, a two-time Floribama mullet toss. He's the two-time winner of the Floribama mullet toss in both 2005 and 2006, which I think warrants an explanation.
Yeah, I'll be happy to give pointers on how to throw a fish after this. So anyway, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share with you some of the things that we've been doing and some of the synthesis work that we've done about nearshore fish after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and what we've learned after a decade of work. And the bulk of this work was funded through the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, and I was fortunate enough to work with two different consortia, the Coastal Waters Consortium and the Alabama Center for Ecological Resilience. And I can't get too far into this without acknowledging that there's a lot of folks that put a lot of time and work into what you're going to see here, and I'd like to acknowledge their contributions. Okay, so to start with, I wanted to use the same conceptual diagram referenced in Irv's talk, and he focused on vegetation, which is important habitat and forms a base of the food web for what I want to talk about, and that is the nekton, or the free-swimming fishes and larger invertebrates. And I've highlighted where nekton fits in conceptually here. And around 2010, of course, Irv gave a great background of what happened, and everyone was really concerned about the impacts of the spill, how the fishing industry and the ecological communities would respond, and how that would in turn affect the local economies that are tied to these resources. And these are just a few of headlines from newspapers throughout the northern Gulf region, and demonstrate this concern for the local environment and economies. And obviously this is what most folks expected. In the years following the spill, we've had the opportunity to learn a great deal about the impacts of the spill on the coastal nearshore ecosystem. So in this talk, I want to hit the highlights of some of those findings. Specifically, today I want to talk about what we've learned about coastal fishes and their response to oil since 2010. So to start to answer this question, I've worked with a large group of scientists on a synthesis effort, and this is led by Brian Roberts at LumCon to synthesize all the information and scientific literature about oil impacts to coastal fish related to this spill. So we used a standardized search of the Web of Science to find papers in nearshore areas on fish related to the spill. The search returned 102 different scientific articles. This peaked around 2017 with 21 articles. And then we went in and we filtered those into several categories based on the objectives of this synthesis. There were 7 original field-based reports of changes in fish catch per unit effort, 28 studies that focused on fish at an individual level. These are mostly physiological or contaminant-based studies, 8 reviews, 4 modeling papers, 29 were a different Deepwater Horizon topic, something like oil transport that just happened to mention all of our search terms, 22 related to a different organism altogether, and 4 that were just not relevant. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the first 2 categories to tell the story of what we've learned about fishes after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Those 28 papers on a single individual of a species tell a pretty consistent story. And that is pretty simply that if you put a fish in oil, bad things happen. All right. Not only is it toxic and harmful, causing things like these fish lesions, but it also causes many different deformations during larval stages of development. It can have genomic changes, fitness consequences to things like reproduction, and it can alter various behaviors. So we know that oil has the potential to be really bad. But when we zoom out and think about the coast as a whole, are there as many kinds and numbers of these fish in the wild? And so to answer that, these are those 7 field-based comparisons that I previously mentioned. I scored them all on this nice color-coded scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being sustained positive effects in blue, to 3 being no effect or neutral in white, and 5 in red being a sustained negative impact. And these 7 studies are listed here in chronological order, and I'll tell you more about them in the next slide. So these studies all focus on nearshore areas throughout the Gulf of Mexico in one of 3 habitat classifications: seagrass in green, marshes in brown, and shallow non-vegetated areas in black. So some of these are original field collections, some utilize state and federal fisheries independent sampling programs. And you'll notice that not only is there a variety of different gear used to collect and compare these fishes, but there's also a variety of study designs. Some are before versus after the spill, some are control versus impacted areas, and some, like Ken Abel's paper in 2014, didn't start until 2 years after the spill. And for something like a killifish, which may only live 2 to 4 years, this is pretty important. So we scored all these studies based on their overall impact to population or community level assemblages based on the descriptions in these papers. And you can see that the majority showed no change, or in fact, sometimes slightly positive effects reported. And so I wanted to highlight a few of these studies and give you an idea of some of their findings. This is one of the first studies to come out after the spill by Joel Fodry and Ken Heck, and it shows that from the Panhandle to the Chandelier Islands, the summer of 2010 did not exhibit that predicted decline in fish populations, at least in the nearshore environment. In the salt marsh, we looked at a number of different fish and areas in Terrebonne Bay and Barataria Bay, Louisiana, and found no difference in catch per unit effort using minnow traps. And off the Barrier Islands near Dauphin Island, Alabama, we actually found that abundance spiked in the 2 to 3 years after the spill. And this was accompanied by a shift in the community structure, as shown in this MDS plot. So each one of these points is a sample, and the closer they are together, the more similar the community structure is. So you can see that the period between 2010 to 2012 really stands out here. And this was driven by increases in things like spot and croakers, those cyanids. Well, the big story here is that we didn't really see those negative effects that, offshore people, for example, had reported. And it turns out in a review on the topic, we were not the only folks to notice these lack of devastating consequences for the nearshore estuarine fishes. Other studies of oil effects on fish at the population and community level also found no differences, some even finding increases after the spill. And I do want to point out that the one study showing a negative effect, Moody et al. 2013, showed a decline in goby density and biomass that rebounded after a year. And then we compare these to those studies at the individual level, those physiological effects. All of those have found that oil has a net negative effect on fishes. So we have a situation where we know fish are susceptible, but it doesn't really scale up to the populations and communities. And there are numerous potential consequences potential mechanisms that could account for this contradiction. So in this talk, I want to highlight some of our work on a few of these different mechanisms. One, for example, mobile organisms such as fish may have the capacity to detect and flee and avoid oiled areas, and in that way minimize their exposure to these contaminants. And then there are confounding variables, things like number 5. When the oil spill hit, NOAA closed the fishery, which essentially made the whole northern Gulf of Mexico a very large marine protected area, protected from fishing. And number 6, there's some evidence that predators of fish, like birds and dolphins, are really sensitive to oil, and so their death could mask negative effects of the spill by releasing that predation pressure. And so I'll tell you a little bit about a few of the projects we have been working on to determine mechanisms behind this disconnect and what the food web impacts this spill may have had. We found that marsh fish do indeed show some avoidance behavior. We set up really simple experiments between oiled sediment or unoiled sediment at different concentrations, and that's represented here by the green, yellow, or red for low, medium, high oil concentrations. We found that these marsh fishes, consistently spend more time over the unoiled section of the tank when fresh oil is present. But when it came to weathered oil, that preference went away, and that indicates that these fish are likely queuing in on some of the volatile toxic chemicals that weather off as oil becomes degraded through wave action, UV exposure, and other mechanisms. We can take this a step further and look at how different populations vary in their oil response. So doing these same tests with, in this case, Gulf killifish or cockahoo minnows, we compared fish that we captured in Terrebonne Bay, Mississippi Sound, Perdido Bay, and here in Cedar Key, and we found that the response does indeed vary with population. Now this is a little different way to look at that data as a response ratio. So avoidance of oil would be below this dotted line, and preference for oil would be above the dotted line. And so this response decreases as you move east, which is really an important finding in terms of the predictive framework that we can develop for, hey, what if an oil spill hits on the Gulf Coast of Florida? There might be much different results than what we saw in Louisiana. And again, we saw that weathered oil they did not respond to. But we can also test whether previous exposure to oil changes this behavior. This is work done in the mesocosm facility down at Lumcon, where the marsh was experimentally oiled. This is maintained and overseen by Brian Roberts and his team down there. And we see in this case that after they've been exposed to different concentrations, the unexposed fish retain this avoidance behavior, while even at low concentrations, fish lose that avoidance response. So all it takes is very little exposure to lose this behavior. Okay, so we think behavior could be part of the story, and we started to explore other mechanisms, specifically using experiments and modeling exercises to address other pathways whereby the negative effects at the individual level don't translate up to community and population level. The effects that come through the reduction in predators abundance, as well as the effects that come from the reduction in fishing, because when the spill hit, of course, NOAA closed the fishery for public safety. This work started out as a literature search to sort of lay out what we think the marsh food web looks like. And so we did that. Each line connecting these major groups indicates that that organism is eaten by the other organism. And then we overlaid oil sensitivities, and this approach allowed us to assess how important and how connected an organism is in the food web, as well as their sensitivity to oil. And so what we found from this is that, yes, those dolphins and birds, both major predators of fish, fell out in the upper right quadrant here as critically sensitive species, those that were both important in the food web and sensitive to oil. And so we continued this work by putting together a more complex model using Kim de Mutsert's ecopath model. We know a little bit more about who eats who and the biomass of who eats who. And so this is a much more detailed model. And then we can turn off fishing or turn off predators and see how these different groups respond to each of these alterations. So here's what the model came out looking like, as complicated a roadmap as you would expect, and when you think about what eats what out in the environment. And the preliminary results show that the direct effects of predators and fishing on many organisms is quite variable. Closing the fishery had an effect on menhaden and crabs, while the death of dolphins and birds had more of an effect on some of the species like the cyanids, things like the spot, croaker, and redfish. So I also want to mention that some of the exposure work that we've been doing to look at how exposure affects the foraging ability. In this case, we exposed these cockahoe minnows to oil and then measured their foraging behavior, how fast they can eat. What we found is, so far, is that when fish are exposed to very high levels, they don't feed as well. So this is another implication for predator-prey interactions in coastal food webs. And moving forward, we want to know a little bit more about the anti-predator behavior, how things like schooling behavior is affected by oil exposure. Okay, so to wrap this up, this is the question that I posed earlier in the talk. What have we learned about fish and their responses to oil since 2010? So to summarize, coastal fish populations and communities were surprisingly resilient to oil, despite the fact that we know oil can be very bad. And the reasons for that were very complex. And today we think it's a combination of things, from behavior to NOAA cessation of fishing and the death of fish predators, all contributed to the resilience that those field studies have reported on. Moving forward, we want to continue to use those modeling and experimental exercises to better understand how oil affects fish in these nearshore coastal environments. And with that, there's a lot of folks to thank for making this happen. And I'll be happy to take questions when we're all finished talking here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great talk, Charlie.